A state of emergency in Zimbabwe. Extreme drought putting millions of people in danger. As wars rage in Gaza and Ukraine, the battle against climate change continues, but arguably makes fewer headlines. Is the world paying enough attention to the threat the entire planet faces? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Zimbabwe has been hit by a severe drought, destroying crops on which millions of people rely for food. It's another example of the impact of climate extremes worldwide, a threat facing the whole planet, say scientists, who warn that action is needed immediately to avert long-term disaster. For those who've become victims of the impact of climate change, it may already be too late. Man-made catastrophes such as the wars in Gaza and Ukraine are in sharp focus internationally, reflecting the horrors of conflict. But while attention is quite properly given to these political disasters, is enough being given to the global threat from climate change? Does the world's attention need to be refocused? We'll be discussing this and more with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Sharif.
Dry fields and wasted crops. A severe drought in South Africa has left 20 million people going hungry. After Malawi and Zambia, Zimbabwe has declared a state of disaster too, leaving a region that was once an agricultural powerhouse and grain exporter needing emergency aid to feed its own people.
Our food situation is difficult. We only eat once a day because we have nothing in the fields, not a single grain. Everything has dried up in the drought. We also have problems with sourcing water.
El Nino, the naturally occurring climate pattern that warms parts of the Pacific Ocean every 2 years, has a major impact on world weather. In South Africa, it typically causes below average rainfall, but this year it brought the worst drought in decades. The United Nations says major food-growing areas in Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, Zambia and Zimbabwe have seen some of the lowest rainfall in 40 years.
The crop production is very much affected by the current El Nino situation. After the first rains in January, but since then there has been no rain. So we're really dreading to see the results of the second crop and livestock assessment, because it will likely tell us about the very poor production during this year.
Scientists say climate change is raising sea levels, melting ice sheets, causing more intense storms and frequent wildfires. For the first time in January, the world breached the benchmark warning level of a global increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade. Experts predict a further supercharging of global warming from effects such as El Nino, delivering record-breaking temperatures. Last year was already the hottest on record globally. Droughts, floods and other extreme weather is expected as global temperatures continue to rise. Venezuela is already battling a record number of wildfires. Its Amazon region recorded nearly 6,000 fires in March alone. But the impact of rising global temperatures goes beyond human life. It's wreaking havoc on wetlands in northern Albania. The Verne Lagoon is seeing a steep decline in the number of migratory birds.
Rising water temperatures, rising sea levels and other phenomena have led to a decline in fish stocks, including eels, in all lagoons in Albania, as in the rest of Europe.
Conflicts and climate crises are affecting the lives of millions around the world. But the urgent need to tackle climate change seems to be overshadowed by wars in Gaza and Ukraine, as well as other geopolitical unrest. Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our panel in Dublin, in Ireland. John Sweeney is Professor Emeritus at Maynooth University and a specialist in climate change. In Kenya's capital, Nairobi, Maurice Onyango is Regional Head of Disaster Risk Management of Plan International. That's an independent development and humanitarian organization. And in Bonn, in Germany, Carlo Buentempo is Director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service. Thanks for joining us all today. We appreciate you being with us on Inside Story. Maurice, let me start with you today. Zimbabwe has declared a national disaster over this drought, and President Emmerson Mnangagwa says the country needs $2 billion in aid to help millions of people who are going hungry. He's appealed to UN agencies. He's appealed to local businesses. Will the country actually be able to get this aid, and just how bad is the situation?
Thank you very much. I believe that the country should get the aid that they are requesting, because in this century, in fact, no human being should be dying of hunger. No child should be dropping out of school because of drought, and no girl should be married off because the family cannot feed them. This is a prick on our conscience as a humanity, and we need to act and do something now so that at least the children that are suffering in Southern Africa can get the food that they need. The girls can be in school and not married off so that they can feed their family. And the situation is bad. It's really, really dire in Southern Africa. Plan International with other agencies have been assessing the situation, and the reports that we are getting is really, really bad. According to the Southern Africa Development Committee, the region has really received very, very limited rain in 40 years, some of the worst Jan to March rain. 20 million people are currently in need of humanitarian assistance, and it is going across the whole region. We are seeing in areas where Plan International is working, in Malawi, in Zimbabwe, and in Mozambique, in Zambia, we are seeing very high levels of absenteeism already because families cannot feed their children. Children are dropping out of school so that they can also get work so that they can support their family, which is not really something that should be happening in this century. So the international community needs to act, and act now to avert this catastrophe that we are seeing in Southern Africa.
John, you just heard Maurice say that the international community needs to act to combat all this. Of course, we know that wars are raging in Gaza and Ukraine. This means that even though the battle against climate change continues, climate change is making far fewer headlines than it has in the past. Is the world paying enough attention to this threat that the entire planet is facing?
No, it's not. And of course, everything that Maurice said is very valid. But I think the problem is that people just switch off with the latest headline. And, you know, we hear on our television screens and our radio, we hear about these extreme events, but it doesn't propel us, at least in the developed world, into joining the dots and saying that a country like Zimbabwe suffering those extremes, it's not their fault. It's not them that have caused the drought concerned. It's really the developed world. And it's getting that accountability across to the general public that I think is the biggest problem that we face in terms of communicating climate change at the moment. We have a difficulty in that people, they tend to react to short-term concerns rather than medium-term concerns and long-term concerns. So the pressing events that we see on our screens every night, for example, captures their attention. But the prospect of something, a slow onset event like a drought, that doesn't really capture people's attention. And also, of course, when we're dealing with climate, we're dealing with something where there is an element of uncertainty. And traditionally, I suppose climate scientists have been reluctant to label events like the problems in Zimbabwe as caused by climate change. For most of my career, I had to hedge around a question relating to individual events like that. But I'm very pleased that now science has advanced to the point with the attribution studies that we can now do, that we can label such events. And I think that will bring an immediacy to those kinds of extreme events, especially to decision makers. And that's something I'm very hopeful will, if you like, move the dial a bit and join the dots between who's causing the problem, what can we do about it in the developed world, and how do we protect some of the people who are most vulnerable that Maurice is talking about there.
Carlo, I saw you reacting to some of what John was saying there. It looked like you wanted to jump in, so I'll give you the opportunity.
No, I was just thinking, I agree completely with what is being said. I guess in general, we have two challenges. One challenge is to distinguish between what is, of course, response of the climate system to our collective emission, and this is certainly, as is stated in the Summit for Policymaker of the Sixth Assessment Report of the IPCC, this is certainly playing a role in some of these events that we are describing today. In that the precipitation response to the natural variability is likely to become stronger in a warmer world. At the same time, we also have to account for the natural variability itself. And we do know that the El Nino is the warm phase of an oscillation that has a cold phase as well, which is La Nina, that occurs every few years, between 2 and 7 on average. And these, with El Nino, there is a higher chance of below average precipitation in a good swath of Southern Africa. So in a sense, this is not caused per se by climate change. That natural variability has existed for decades, for centuries, for millennia possibly. But the impact on the ground are felt more strongly now because we are living in a fundamentally different world. We are living in a world that bears very little resemblance climate-wise to the world our previous generation lived in. So we are now 1.2, 1.3 degrees above the pre-industrial temperature for the global mean average. And this basically describes a world that is fundamentally different. And as a consequence of that, we see stronger impact also from the variation in natural variability.
Carlo, let me ask you, since you brought up El Nino, I want to ask you, how is the current El Nino climate pattern different than ones we've seen in the past?
Well, this El Nino started last year, end of spring, and it was declared El Nino by early summer by the World Meteorological Organization. What determines typically the status of El Nino is the temperature of the tropical Pacific Ocean. And there are several thresholds, but something in the order of a degree or degree and a half above the normal temperature of the Pacific signal moderate El Nino, as it was the one of 23 to 24. In that sense, El Nino starting by late spring, early summer, and then evolving and reaching the peak around Christmas for a normal evolution of El Nino. And now we are in a decaying phase that is likely to get back to neutral condition by late spring, if not switching to La Nina by summer. What was strange of this El Nino was the fact that a lot of what the climate scientists call teleconnections have not been in place or were not as strong or as clear as the typical connection. Teleconnection means what happened in different parts of the world, not in the Pacific, on some of the most iconic climate variables, such as temperature and precipitation. The canonical response of El Nino, for instance, is a dry and warm signal over Australia, over Indonesia, a sort of warm and dry signal in winter over Southern Africa, and so on and so forth.
Carlo, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it looks to me like, John, like you wanted to add something to what Carlo was saying, so please go ahead.
I wanted to add to what Carlo was saying there. This El Nino has been unusual, but it's been unusual in one respect in particular, and that is the warmth of the oceans all over the globe, in fact. By the end of last year, 90% of the world's oceans had experienced a marine heat wave. And that's quite unusual in the middle, even of an El Nino event. So it's telling us that there's been a bit of a dislocation of climate going on. As Carlo was saying, the expected teleconnections weren't as strong as one might expect. And even, despite the changes we saw, there were other things at work, even making the El Nino, if you like, on steroids in some respects. And that is a lesson to us. I think that we may be disrupting global climate on a scale which we haven't really appreciated fully yet. We saw, for example, huge losses in the Antarctic sea ice. We've seen massive glacier losses on land as well. So I think we're seeing things happen that maybe we haven't been quite prepared for. And of course, when we see those on our screens and on our radio, there's an element of climate fatigue sets in with the general public as well. So we have to be aware that we have to convey the message, perhaps in a more original way, perhaps in a more direct way than we did in the past. And that's maybe what we can learn from last year, the warmest year, let's remember, in over 100,000 years. That's a severe lesson for us to take on board, I think.
Maurice, let me ask you to follow up a little bit on what John was talking about there, because, he's essentially saying that, the world really needs to be paying more attention to all this. Of course, we're talking about a time right now where you have Zambia and Malawi. They've also recently declared states of disasters due to drought. And there are fears that this drought that's sweeping throughout southern Africa could be one of the worst in decades. How can you make people pay more attention to this and actually start acting on it and doing something about it?
Thank you. I think the evidence is very, very clear. The dying, that people are dying, the malnutrition, malnourishment of children, the numbers that we are seeing that are missing food in Southern Africa, and the frequency of droughts. Even the countries like Zambia that have been almost net producers of cereals are now in trouble. That tells you that the situation is extremely, extremely dire. And it all goes back to what John was mentioning earlier, that even this current El Nino is very different. We are seeing extreme cases of climate in the whole region, not only Southern Africa. The whole El Nino effect, even in Eastern Africa, it was the same, causing flooding in areas which are relatively usually very dry. So the international community, I think we need to really, really go back and start acting on our promises, making sure that people don't die in this century because of droughts. We know that it's going to get worse because of climate change, but we can do something. We can act. We can make sure that we are supporting children to go back to school. We can make sure that we are supporting communities to avoid hunger, and it is still something that is going to really get worse. So we have just to make sure that we are allocating resources. Even governments, what we are appealing also as Plan International is that governments also need to start investing in safety nets, because climate change is going to be here with us. Governments, international community need to start allocating money in terms of the promises that they have made on climate change, so that at least there is access for communities to get funding that they can help in terms of alternative livelihoods and resilient livelihoods. So
Maurice,
it's something that we need to really invest in.
Maurice, let me also ask you about some of the other knock-on effects of all this. I mean, you talked about how there could potentially also be flooding. But the fact of the matter is right now, you have the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. They're saying that this drought is causing many people to use unsafe water sources. This may potentially fuel cholera outbreaks, and that's something that's already affecting several southern African countries, as I understand. So how much worse could this get?
It will really get worse. As you mentioned correctly, Southern Africa has had one of the worst effects of cholera. Several countries as a whole, even Zambia, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, all of them have had very serious cases of cholera. And WHO has mentioned it very clearly that this has been one of the worst cases of cholera. And this was mainly driven by inadequate access to water because of the drought that we are facing in Southern Africa. So the situation, because of climate change, it will even get worse, because we are going to be having most of these episodes of extreme climate more regularly, as we have seen in the recent past. So investments around alternatives, supporting communities, making sure that they have access to water, making sure that they have access to food, resilient agriculture. All these are things that we all need to invest in at the local level, but also getting support from the international community, because the situation will not just get better, it will get worse.
John, I can see you want to jump in. I'll give you that opportunity in just a minute. I just need to ask Carlo a quick question. Carlo, you know, we're at a point in time now where droughts, the floods, and other extreme weather events, they're expected to only increase. You have global temperatures that are continuing to rise. From your perspective, what measures should policymakers be taking to try to mitigate the impacts of all of this? And you know, how can they make the world more aware that more needs to be done?
Well, you know, from a climate science point of view, the response is quite straightforward in the sense that we do understand the fundamental physics behind the global warming, and this is directly related to the emission of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So if we want to revert or mitigate the impact of climate change, we need to reach net zero emission in the fastest possible way. But I would like also to go back to what John was saying about the framing of climate change, and this is linked to the adaptation as well, because the example we are discussing today about the drought in Southern Africa and in Zimbabwe, I think is an example of where the way in which we frame the problem can actually change the action. So the impact you were asking to Maurice on livelihood, on health, is to some extent can be predicted. So the fact that this El Nino was well predicted back in May, so we knew that the El Nino was coming, we knew it was going to be at least a moderate El Nino, meant that some preparatory action has taken place and has been possible because we do know something about the climate. And this is true on the seasonal timescale, and to some extent, this is true on the multi-decadal timescale. So we have information that is relevant for policymaker, for decision maker, but as a society, we are not yet fully capable of taking full advantage of this information. So in a sense, for me, this is a strategic angle to climate change. Mm-hmm. We do know something about the climate and what the climate is going to do in the future. There are surprises. There are surprises, and 2023 was a good example of a few surprises. And John was mentioning, you know, the loss of sea ice in Antarctica, the jump in the global mean temperature in September, or the heat waves in North Atlantic. But there is an awful lot of things we do know about the climate. And as a society, we are not yet taking full advantage of this information.
Right.
So my plea to the policymaker is to do more in considering the evidence that exists, considering the information we have about the near future.
Right.
Because there is.
Sorry to interrupt you, Carlo, but I see John has been wanting to jump in here for a while. Go ahead, John.
I was going to respond to what Maurice was saying about knock-on effects. And as somebody who has stood close to the great Victoria Falls when there was no water going over the falls, as I imagine is very much the case now, you begin to realize that it's not just agricultural drought, it's not just food supply, it's the generation of electricity for the cities, for commerce, for industry. It's the stifling of economic development that goes on as an indirect knock-on effect of climate change of this nature. So I think we have to take a wide view here of where we have to concentrate our investment flows. Now, in 2021, climate-related finance flows were about $1.3 trillion. But we know that from the period from about now on to the end of the century, the need is going to be $1,300 trillion. So, you know, that's a huge jump in terms of how we cope with climate change in the future. And I think that's what I think Maurice was kind of getting at there, the fact that we're not responding on the scale that's sufficient to tackle this problem. And it's partly because of self-interest in our own well-developed economies that we won't part with the money that's necessary to undo the damage that we are culpable of. So it's a question of information. It's a question of sensitizing the public. It's a question of how do we tell them about climate change? How do we get away from the kind of fatigue, from the short-term difficulties? And that's a job, I think, partly for media. It's partly a job to get the message across maybe more effectively than we have. Because scientists, I'll be honest, scientists are not good communicators. We're not brought up in a tradition of communicating the message other than through scientific papers and conferences that have a very limited audience. So I think we have to change the way we communicate climate science, the criticality of it, if you like, to the general public. And that's a big task for which we need an informed media, first of all. And let's be honest, some of our media interviewers, not yourself, but we do get media interviewers brought up in a tradition which is a non-scientist tradition, and the questions they ask are often not the best questions, and we get scientists who can't give the best communication in terms of answers. So we have to tackle that issue, I think, if we're to get the sensitization of the general public to this problem up to the level at which they will say, yes, I'm responsible and I'm willing to forego some of my income tax, some of the 1% of global GDP that it would take to avoid 1.5 degrees. I'm willing to forgo 1% of global GDP to make good our promises to the developing world.
Maurice, I saw you reacting to a lot of what John was saying there, and I'm interested to get your take. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but let me ask you. John was saying that essentially, a lot of us, that we're just not responding on the scale that's needed to this climate crisis, right? You're seeing this all on a very human level when it comes to the people that you're working with, the communities that you're observing. How do we get to a place where this is being given the attention and is getting the political will that it needs in order to actually move the needle going forward?
Thank you. I think what I'm seeing is that the global community are not really very close at the point where this is happening. And that is one of the things that I think the media, as John is mentioning, can also play a very critical role to really amplify the voices of these people who are worst affected by climate crisis. Because what we have seen also is that we talk a lot at the global level. We make a lot of promises in terms of climate financing, but in terms of actualizing those promises, it has been a bit slow. So that is something that we need to really make sure we are getting more and more of the evidence from the field, like what we are seeing in Southern Africa now, what we have seen in the communities where we are working as Plan International. We have seen very devastating effects of climate change. And one of the things that we are also emphasizing, several, I'll just make a few points on some of the things that we are emphasizing, is that the issue about reduction in terms of greenhouse emissions, it should be a fundamental agreement globally that we need to reduce it. Countries that have contributed less are the ones being worst affected, and we need to really act on this. Investments in resilient livelihoods. For example, communities that we are working with as Plan International, some of them are very, very, very poor, and they don't have the means to really invest in alternative livelihoods. The international community should come up with mechanisms that can support these very, very vulnerable communities.
Thanks to all of our guests today, John Sweeney, Maurice Onyango, and Carlo Buentempo. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.